So, Branko, in the last segment, we were talking about the sanctions that were imposed on Venezuela starting in mid 2017, I guess it was, by the U.S. and the what they encompass. And presumably, these sanctions were in response to human rights violations by the Maduro government, and also, I guess, mechanisms in which Maduro was using extra constitutional mechanisms or mechanisms that were of dubious constitutionality to increase his power. And I guess, I mean, I don't know what the U.S. government says these sanctions are. They're in in response to this, but it's not quite clear to me what the U.S. government has articulated is supposed to happen from these sanctions. It's supposed to punish the government of Venezuela, but this report that you write about suggests that it does not punish the government of Venezuela. It, in fact, punishes the people.
Yeah, which, is a pattern among pretty much every other case of sanctions, at least, that we can think of in the last 2 decades. But in Venezuela, I mean, the stats in this report are really, when you read them, are horrifying. One of the most striking is that the August 2017 sanctions had sent oil falling, the oil production falling in the country by more than 3 times the rate of the previous 20 months. So they lost around $6 billion worth of revenue from that. And, the authors kind of put it into perspective. So they point out that to get food and medicine in 2018 cost about 2 point something billion. So, to lose $6 billion just in sort of 1 year, you can already shows you how devastating that is. One of the most striking statistics that they kind of talk about is they look at this study that's conducted yearly by universities in Venezuela, and they looked at the mortality rate, the change in mortality rate, and they found that if these stats are accurate, and there's no reason to assume that they aren't, there were 40,000 extra deaths between 2017 and 2018, which it's very clear that is linked to the sanctions. And it goes on like this. I mean, they talk about how oil revenues for this year are expected to drop by 67% from last year. So, it will be going from what was an already pretty catastrophic drop to there's not even really a superlative to describe, where that's going to go. And then, not only that, but they talk about how the sanctions and the Trump administration has basically worked to basically make it impossible for the Venezuelan government to actually rectify this situation. So, we can't know counterfactuals. Perhaps if these things hadn't been in place, the Maduro government would have continued to, fail to diversify the economy and engage in corruption and to just simply not do what needed to be done to stabilize the economy, and perhaps it would have gone off the cliff anyway. But we know that, without that counterfactual, we do know that the Trump administration has basically made it impossible for them to do anything. They've convinced other countries not to buy their oil, which actually sent production dropping by 130,000 barrels per day. And previously it had been dropping, I think in the 6 months of the year before, it had been dropping by about 20,000 or 25,000 barrels per day. I mean, it's pretty stark stuff. They've frozen their assets. So, any sort of, for example, the gold reserves that Venezuela has, they can't draw on those either. So they can't use those to purchase medicine. There's a program that of preferential payment for oil that Venezuela has with Caribbean countries. They can't receive payment from those countries for that. So basically, there's almost no avenue for Venezuela to take to try and rectify this. And this is why the UN Special Rapporteur that visited the country, he said that this was illegal, these sanctions, and that sanctions like these amounted to what was basically the equivalent of a modern day siege. Basically just walling a population in, and making it impossible for anything to get in and out.
I mean, what is, the bizarre thing about this is that you don't hear, and there's undoubtedly been human rights violations under the Maduro government. I mean, and I think there's undoubtedly been a restriction on democracy and mistreatment of prisoners. But all of those words could be said about Saudi Arabia and many other countries that we are supportive of. I mean, the irony is, it seems like the big story that we're told as to justifying U.S. intervention in Venezuela, and is the suffering of the Venezuelan people, but in fact, we are not doing anything to alleviate the suffering of the Venezuelan people. On some level, it's just it's an ultimatum. It's get a new government or continue to suffer.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you point out, the idea that the Trump administration is in any way concerned about human rights is a joke. I mean, no one can take that seriously, especially when the Trump administration is very happy to support a wide variety of repressive regimes that are in Venezuela. Also, I mean, would you appoint Elliot Abrams to be the head of your Venezuelan policy if you cared deeply about the human rights of Venezuelan people? I would say probably not. Elliot Abrams, for example, has described himself as a counter-revolutionary, and that was what his goal and what his job was in the 80s in the Reagan administration, which was to basically roll back the left-wing tide in Central and South America, and this is basically just a continuation of that. I mean, it's the same thing with John Bolton. John Bolton has said similar things to that. So, of course, this has nothing to do with human rights. And I think, you're right. It's an ultimatum for one. And I think secondly, it helps to feed that narrative. Well, this is what happens when you have a socialist government. It just leads to an inherent mismanagement of the economy, which leads to widespread starvation, lack of medicine, yada, yada, yada. And a lot of the media has been very helpful for the Trump administration in this. They've pretty much broadcast and repeated this message everywhere you go. I mean, a lot of reporting, whether it's TV or print, does not even bother to mention the sanctions. Or if they do, they'll sort of say, well, sanctions have definitely contributed, but ultimately the problem here is the Maduro regime. It's the economic policies. I mean, this is a kind of a great illustration of the way that, media that is ostensibly, it's not state media, of course. There's no state media in the U.S., but that's always one of those very peculiar things where a media that is entirely not controlled by the government voluntarily kind of repeats its talking points for it.
Without a doubt. And if the Maduro government was in that bad a shape, you wouldn't need sanctions to have it implode. But of course, the argument in some level is self-defeating. Well, Branko Marcetic, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.